And thank you for coming. I'm Kat Mikulski. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Law Review, and it's my honor to welcome you to the Arthur W. Fisk Memorial Lecture, which is serving this year as the inaugural Case Western Reserve Law Review Distinguished Lecture. We're delighted to have with us Professor Jessica Mantel from the University of Houston, who's going to discuss the influence of organizational culture on clinical decision-making, implications for law, policy, and ethics. And I'd now like to turn the floor over to Professor Sharona Hoffman from our very own Law Medicine Center, who graciously agreed to introduce Professor Mantel's lecture.
Good afternoon. Professor Jessica Mantel is at the University of Houston's Health Law and Policy Institute, which she co-directs. Before becoming an academic, Professor Mantel worked for 8 years for 2 federal agencies, and given the shutdown, she's very glad she's not there right now. Professor Mantel was a senior attorney in the Office of the General Counsel for the Department of Health and Human Services, where she advised the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services on legal issues related to Medicare. She also was a health policy analyst in the Government Accounting Office, where she evaluated Medicare payment issues. Previously, Professor Mantel practiced law as an associate in the healthcare department of the prestigious firm of Ropes and Gray in Boston, and she even has a strong Cleveland connection. She clerked for Judge Karen Nelson Moore of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit right here in Cleveland, and Judge Moore is a very good friend of this law school. Professor Mantel holds a BA in psychology from the University of Pennsylvania and a JD and Master's in public policy from the University of Michigan. I've heard her speak at several events. She's terrific, and we're in for a real treat.
Well, thank you, Sharona, and I want us to start off by thanking Case Western Reserve Law School, and in particular the Law Review, for inviting me here today. As Professor Hoffman mentioned, I do have a Cleveland connection. I lived here for a year while I was clerking here after law school, so it's been a real treat for me to come back to visit. And it's especially nice to be here given that the weather in Houston is still in the high 80s and low 90s and really humid, so I'm enjoying this beautiful fall weather that you have here. Obviously, this is a really big week in the world of healthcare with the launching of the state exchanges under healthcare reform. But what I want to talk today is about another trend going on in healthcare right now. And that's the trend of physicians increasingly becoming employees or otherwise affiliated with large healthcare organizations. So in the 20th century, the dominant force in the world of healthcare was the independent physician. So the solo practitioner or the physician that was part of a small group practice. And these physicians were largely free from bureaucratic controls and had a lot of professional autonomy, especially when it came to patient care issues. But this model of the solo practitioner or small group physician has been in steady decline for over 25 years from now. And in fact, one doctor I know of referred to it as a dinosaur, soon to become extinct. And so today what we're seeing is the growing dominance of large healthcare organizations. So already about half of all physicians are part of an organization that's affiliated with a large health system. Hospitals are constantly saying what one of their major strategic initiatives right now is to increase their employment of physicians, particularly primary care physicians. And then a big trend in healthcare right now is the emergence of what's called accountable care organizations. So these are large organizations comprised of physicians and often a hospital or other healthcare providers that jointly are financially accountable for the cost and quality of care being provided. And this is a new animal, but over the past few years, we're now seeing over 400 accountable care organizations across the country, and that number will only continue to grow. So I think this movement of physicians into the organizational setting raises a lot of important questions. And the question that I want to address today is how these organizations' culture may impact the physician's patient care decisions. And I think this is an important question because it may be that an organization's culture could bias physicians' decision-making in a way that we might consider to be problematic. Maybe it would lead a physician to provide poor quality care or inefficient care, or perhaps to delay or withhold what we might consider to be appropriate care. So when I became interested in this issue, I started to see what empirical research may have been done to show what kind of connection there may be between physicians' decision-making and organizations' culture. And I have to say there's just kind of some limited research out there, but there's not a lot. But from what I was finding, there really does appear to be this connection between physicians' patient care decisions and an organization's culture. So various studies have shown that physicians within the same practice often will develop a common practice style. And then I found a couple studies that I thought were really interesting that looked at physicians who have admitting privileges at 2 or more hospitals. And you might expect those physicians would have a consistent practice style across those 2 hospitals where they practice, but instead the researchers found that physicians will conform to the practice norms of a particular hospital where they've admitted a patient. So specifically what was found was that these physicians would admit patients for longer lengths of stay at the hospitals that had higher average lengths of stays, and would discharge patients sooner from those hospitals that had shorter average length of stay, even after controlling for differences in the patient characteristics. And so I think these studies were really interesting because to me it illustrated the potential influence of an organization's culture on a physician's patient care decisions. So what I want to do today then is draw from the fields of psychology, sociology, and behavioral economics to give you a theory of how exactly an organization's culture might be influencing physicians' patient care decisions. And then I want to conclude my talk today by talking about what some of the implications of that may be for health law, policy, and ethics. So before getting into my theory about organizations' culture and its impact on physicians, it's important to first understand how physicians make decisions. Sometimes there may be little question as to what the correct diagnosis may be for a patient, or there may be a clear standard of care that suggests what the appropriate treatment should be for a patient. But about half the time, science doesn't provide a clear pathway to diagnosis or treatment. You may have a patient with an unusual mix of treatment, and it may be unclear what the correct diagnosis is. Or with respect to different medical interventions, there may be just limited evidence on the relative effectiveness of different options, or there may be conflicting studies as to whether or not a particular course of treatment will be worthwhile for a particular patient. So there can be a lot of clinical uncertainty when physicians make decisions. And in addition, there can be some questions of how to weigh the competing values that are often inherent in treating patients. So how should a physician weigh the potential benefits of a particular medical intervention relative to its potential risks? Should the primary goal be to extend a patient's life, or is it more important to try to alleviate the patient's pain and suffering? And how does cost fit into all this? If you have a new diagnostic test, that's a little bit more accurate than pre-existing tests, but at a much higher cost. Should a doctor go with the new diagnostic test, or should they stick with the lower cost other diagnostic test? So science doesn't give us a clear answer to these difficult questions, and yet physicians do have to make decisions. They have to decide, what course of treatment to recommend to a patient. And so what do they do when they're in these situations of clinical uncertainty or ambiguity? Well, physicians rely on their professional intuition and judgment. And specifically, they have cognitive frameworks or schemas that organize their knowledge, their scientific assumptions, and their own personal values. And so these mental roadmaps, which operate largely outside of the physician's conscious awareness, nevertheless will determine how that physician processes information or guide the physician's behavioral responses. So these schemas then will influence, which clinical factors the physician will focus on and which patient characteristics maybe they'll ignore. It will influence which tests to order or what their working diagnosis may be, or whether they should focus on extending the patient's life or alleviating the patient's pain and suffering. And so these schemas, these cognitive schemas, are especially important in these conditions of clinical uncertainty or ambiguity because they fill in the gaps in information, and they give the physician a template for action when there's no clearly correct answer as to what they should do in the situation. And not surprisingly, physicians' cognitive schemas are not uniform. And that's one of the primary reasons why we see wide variations in physicians' practice styles, especially when we have these situations where there really is no clear standard of care. And so these physicians' cognitive schemas in part reflect their professional education and training, as well as the norms of the medical profession generally, that rewards physicians that have a more aggressive practice style. Maybe they're more highly compensated, or they're the physicians that are promoted. So this could lead physicians to invoke heuristics that support this more aggressive practice style. So physicians might say things like, if there's any chance of extending the patient's life, this procedure should be performed regardless of cost. Or they may say things like, well, if we engaged in more watchful waiting rather than aggressively treating this patient's condition, the patient's condition will only worsen over time, so we should intervene aggressively now. Contrast that with an organization that perhaps rewards physicians for lowering the cost of care. So within those organizations, physicians then might try to come up with a clinical justification that would support a less aggressive practice style. So they may be biased to conclude that an aggressive protocol for treating a patient, just poses too great clinical risk to the patient. Or they may say, it's really important that I be a good steward of society's limited healthcare resources, and I think this intervention just, that the benefits are outweighed by the cost. So, in other words, to sort of summarize, an organization, by shaping a physician's self-interest, can impact in really more subconscious ways how that physician is going to perceive a patient's situation, may influence the scientific assumptions or heuristics that guide that physician's treatment decisions, and so ultimately may impact what tests the physician orders, what their diagnosis may be, and what treatment plan they adopt for a patient. Now, I should say that I don't mean to imply that a physician's decisions are always going to be motivated by that physician's self-interest. Obviously physicians are scientists, and they have very strong professional ethics, and I think they genuinely do try to be objective and follow their professional ethics when making patient care decisions. So the capacity for a physician to make self-serving treatment recommendations is constrained by their ability to come up with a plausible justification for a particular treatment option. So that means in cases where the clinical evidence is sort of clear, or where the standards of care are unambiguous, the physicians are going to make decisions consistent with the accepted standard of care. Why so? Because in those cases, it's really difficult for them to rationalize or justify an alternative course of treatment that might be more consistent with their self-interest. So that's one of the reasons that we really don't see much variation in physicians' practices when you do have very clear standards of care. But in that 50% of healthcare decisions where there is this clinical uncertainty or maybe ambiguity as to how to make various value trade-offs, I'm suggesting that physicians may unwittingly use cognitive schemas that lead them to more self-serving decisions. And to the extent that the organization is shaping that physician's self-interest, they're indirectly then influencing the cognitive schemas that the physician is going to apply. So let me spend the final time I have here talking a little bit about the implications of my theory for health law, policy, and ethics. So there's often been a tendency in healthcare to conceptualize patient care as being provided at the level of the individual physician and patient. So law, policy, and ethics, often will focus on the individual physician. But I think with physicians moving to these healthcare organizations, this idea of this independent, autonomous physician will increasingly be a myth. And that it's important we recognize the link between a healthcare organization's culture and the decisions made by their affiliated physicians. So I think we need to focus more attention on these healthcare organizations' culture. So first, looking at the realm of healthcare ethics. Currently, organizational ethics in healthcare tends to emphasize issues that arise in the care of individual patients. So it emphasizes confidentiality or informed consent or end-of-life issues. So I want to suggest that organizational ethics needs to have a broader focus. So focus a little bit more on what an organization's values should be, and then how maybe an organization can ensure that their day-to-day practices within the organization actually reflects these values, particularly when it comes to clinical decisions. And so we may want to think a little bit more about what kind of ethics infrastructure organizations should have in place to maybe promote a more virtuous organization. So for example, healthcare organizations perhaps should have formal practices in place where they review their reward system or maybe any sort of clinical guidelines or protocols the organization has adopted to ensure that these are going to be consistent with the organization's desired values. Second, I want to suggest we pay more attention to how internal organizational structures may shape the healthcare organization's culture. It may be that certain internal structures are more likely to promote a more virtuous organizational culture, and if that's true, then we may want to figure out ways to encourage or even require healthcare organizations to adopt these internal arrangements. In contrast, if particular structures are found to sort of promote cultures that may lead to sort of undesirable patient care decisions, perhaps we want to discourage or even prohibit those types of arrangements. So let me give you two examples of this. So those in the field of organizational culture have long documented that an organization's leaders play a pretty crucial role in shaping an organization's culture. And so there have been some proposals to require physicians or other healthcare professionals in senior leadership positions in an organization. So for example, in the recent Medicare Shared Savings proposed rule, so that's the ACO rule, a couple commenters asked CMS to require that physicians or other healthcare professionals be in key leadership positions within the ACOs. And this seems to reflect an idea that perhaps healthcare professionals, given their training and their ethical, the professional ethical values, might better balance patient care concerns with business considerations. And so they might promote an organizational culture that we think leads to better decision making on the part of physicians. So our first question is that assumption right? And if it is correct, do we then want to require that healthcare organizations have physicians or other health professionals in certain leadership positions? So CMS rejected this proposal in the shared saving rule, but interestingly, they did require that 75% control of an ACO's governing body consist of representatives of the ACO's physicians, as well as hospitals and other providers. And they said this was to ensure that the ACO would be patient-centered and would put patients' interests first. So I think that is sort of an example of a regulatory requirement that was intended to maybe shape an organization's culture in a way that we might think to be a more virtuous culture. A second example may be whether or not we should require healthcare organizations to be not-for-profits. So some people will contend that a not-for-profit organization perhaps is more likely to have a more virtuous organizational culture relative to their for-profit counterparts, given not-for-profit's charitable mission. If that is correct, do we want to require that ACOs or similar organizations be organized as not-for-profit entities? So this is something people talked about a little bit in the past, and it's been very controversial. In the hospital context, studies suggested that maybe for-profits and not-for-profits weren't so different when it came to their policies or their performance, but a different answer was found in the nursing home industry, where there does seem to be some pretty significant differences between for-profit and not-for-profit nursing homes. So I think given some of the changes that we're seeing in healthcare reform right now, especially some of the payment reforms that are pushing the industry further away from traditional fee-for-service compensation to more financial risk sharing at the level of the organization and at the provider level, this question of not-for-profit versus for-profits may be an issue that we should revisit. And then finally, I want to suggest that we look for ways to increase organizations' accountability for patient care. The idea there being that would create some sort of external pressure on organizations that then may shape their cultures in ways that we think might be a little bit more virtuous and lead to more beneficial patient care. And to be fair, a lot of the payment reforms under the healthcare reform are already doing that. We're increasingly seeing providers' payments being tied to their performance on quality metrics, and often those quality metrics are being applied at the organizational level. But there are some inherent limitations of these performance metrics, so I think they do provide somewhat incomplete protection against poor quality care. So maybe we should think about some other ways to hold organizations accountable for patient care decisions. So for example, we may want to monitor healthcare organizations' patterns of care and compare them to one another. And if we see significant deviations from the norm, that might suggest an organization with a more troubling organizational culture. So if an organization has much higher rates of utilization, performs lots and lots of medical interventions, that might suggest they have an organizational culture that's leading their physicians to provide maybe unnecessary care or inefficient care. Vice versa, I would say organizations that have much lower rates of utilization, that might suggest an organizational culture that's leading physicians to delay or withhold appropriate care. So we may want to give regulators the authority to really look at the patterns of care across different healthcare organizations and perhaps prosecute the outliers on the grounds that they're either providing unnecessary care or they're withholding appropriate care. Another example where we can hold organizations more accountable for patient care would be to move to enterprise liability in the medical malpractice realm. So traditionally, malpractice cases have focused on the individual physician. And it's true that courts have started to expand organizations' liability for their physicians' malpractice by being a little more flexible in the rules for vicarious liability, or being a little bit more expansive in holding organizations directly liable for their own negligence at the corporate level. But there are still various doctrinal obstacles that make it difficult for patients to recover from healthcare organizations when they've been harmed due to a physician's negligence. And so we still have a lot of cases then that focus on that individual physician and ignore the impact of a healthcare organization on that physician's treatment decisions. Enterprise liability, however, would shift liability for negligence from the individual physician to the healthcare organization. So it would recognize then this link between an organization's culture and errors in a physician's judgment. And so this in turn would create incentives for organizations to pay closer attention to how their culture may be contributing to poor decision-making on the part of their physicians. So I'll just sort of conclude by saying that I think with this big change, with physicians moving more and more into the organizational setting, we can no longer afford to focus more narrowly on the deeds of the individual physician and ignore the influence of the organization. So I want to encourage scholars and policymakers and others to give greater attention to how exactly organizations, through their culture, may be impacting physician decisions. I hope some other scholars will empirically test my theory, because I guess I should say it really is just a theory with just a little bit of empirical evidence and some studies out there. But also I hope we'll spend a little more time thinking about how to promote more virtuous organizational cultures. And I've given you some of my ideas today, but I really would be interested in hearing other people's thoughts. So this is a complex issue, and I welcome your comments or your questions.
So we'll take questions, and I believe somebody is going to walk around with a microphone. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and the microphone will come to you.
Hi, thanks. That was very interesting. I have a question about your suggestion to monitor for unusual patterns of care. So you start from the supposition that the ones we're talking about now are outside of the practice guideline area. And I think this is what's been troubling us for a while. We know there are differences, sometimes geographic, sometimes between institutions. So what's both an unusual pattern, given that there's no necessary norm that you're starting from? And the second is that, would you worry that you would be targeting institutions that are actually correcting for the problem in whatever they're doing? So your outlier that's either using more care or less care may be doing it more appropriately now than the norm that was pushing in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that you're right that, in these sort of gray zones where maybe we don't really know what the standard of care is, we should probably recognize that there is going to be sort of wide variation. But that's why I'm talking about focusing on outliers. The idea being that if there is, some average here of what's normally done, you'd expect to see some variation, but maybe not people over here or people over there. But also I want to emphasize that when I say patterns of care, I really mean patterns across the organization. So it's not simply looking at one type of medical intervention and comparing what this organization is doing to this organization, because I think you're right that if you see an organization that's maybe on an outlier with respect to one particular medical intervention, maybe they're the ones doing it right and they've figured out that everyone else is being inefficient or not providing an intervention frequently enough. But I think if you repeatedly see this pattern across the organization, that starts to look a little bit more suspicious for me. Okay, but I appreciate your question. Okay.
Did you analyze or control for pharma relationships, either at the institutional level or the physician level? And then, that's my question.
So, well, I didn't actually do any studies myself. So these were studies done by other people. So are you talking about that maybe you're seeing different patterns because of the...
It seems like there's a lot of emphasis that with conflict of interest and pharma relationships come seeping into everything from medical education to actual practice, that it would seem to have a lot of bearing, that it would be interesting at least to see if, some institutions that have strong industry relationships, is there a bias towards,
Yeah, that's a good question. I have to confess, I don't know a lot about the pharmaceutical industry, but my sense is that the relationships are often with individual physicians that are considered to be role models or kind of key leaders. And so I think the pharmaceutical industry often does try to influence those organizational role models in the hopes that they in turn will turn around and influence those around them. And so I think that is kind of consistent with what I was saying, in that you're influenced by what your peers are doing, and you're particularly influenced by what the role models within the organization are doing.
Thank you. I really appreciate your talk, and I think you brought up a lot of great points. I want to go back to the one about the suggestion that physicians be in leadership positions. Now, I work for an organization that is absolutely 100% physician run. And one of the challenges I think that we see is that physicians have been driving the costs of healthcare over the past 25 years. So how, if we move toward that, I think that there are definitely innovative leaders among physicians, but if we move towards that model, are we moving towards something that would change the status quo or just exacerbate it? And if you have any thoughts on that.
Okay, so if I understand your question, you're saying, physicians for a long time have been drivers of higher healthcare costs, and if we put them in positions of leadership, are they going to then promote an organization with a culture of maybe, cost is no object, let's provide a lot of care? Right, is that understanding? Okay, so, I think the response to that is some of these changes going on in payment, where organizations are being held financially accountable in various ways for both the quality of care but also the cost of care. So I mentioned accountable care organizations. So what's happening there is, under the Medicare Shared Savings Program, if these accountable care organizations succeed in lowering the aggregate cost to Medicare for this patient population that the ACO cares for, the ACO gets a percentage of that shared savings. And so if you've got these physicians in key leadership positions, they are, on the one hand, they're physicians, but they're also, in a business leadership position, and they do have to pay attention to the bottom line. And so to the extent that you have these payment reforms going on, I think those physicians will want to balance the physician part of them will want to balance the patient care with the business part of them wanting to ensure that the organization is profitable.
Can I come back to your suggestion about enterprise liability? In general, it's hard to find enterprises liable for the failures of individuals who may work for them.
Right.
Some hospitals are private. They may be affected by the rules on enterprise liability in the private sector. In the public sector, there are very complicated restrictions on imposing liability on a governmental actor as an agency or a government unit as opposed to an individual employee. To the extent that you're proposing greater enterprise liability in this setting, how do the existing doctrines that make it hard to hold private enterprises or governmental units liable affect the likelihood that this approach would be effective?
Can you just repeat the last part of your question there?
It's really hard, say, to win a 1983 claim against a government unit. It's really hard to hold a corporation liable because some individual in the corporation did something wrong. Not that you can't win these at all, but they're really hard. And I'm wondering how those sorts of more general doctrines might affect the prospects for imposing enterprise liability in the medical sector.
Okay. Well, I'll have to confess, I'm not familiar with a range of state laws, but I think in many states where there still is the idea of sovereign immunity or maybe some limited sovereign immunity, they often do carve out public hospitals or others. So I would have to check that, but I think there may be some exceptions for healthcare entities that are also public entities. So does that hopefully answer your question? Okay. And if not, maybe that's a law that has to be changed.
First of all, thank you for both your talk and your article. I found both of them compelling. My question has to do with, I guess, organizational ethics and the drive toward virtuous cultures. You may remember that from your days here that in Cleveland we have two major healthcare organizations. We have University Hospitals and Cleveland Clinic. And I wonder if you are aware within the cultural organization, cultural norms, of restrictions on referring to another HCO. Because my understanding, I've become aware just recently, that by contract, the physicians at one of these HCOs are not allowed to refer to the HCO down the street in a subspecialty situation, even though I can't imagine that in a subspecialty situation they don't know because of their national and international work that the expert is down the street, but they aren't allowed to refer. Are you familiar with that at all? Do you have any concerns about that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the couple of responses are there's this group of healthcare laws called the fraud and abuse laws. So there's the Stark law and the anti-kickback law in particular.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that.
Yeah, so I mean, those provide some constraints, but it sounds like for what
This is
I'm not.
contractual. You work for us, you will refer within the mother house. You will not refer outside.
I mean, I think the other thing that could be going on is to be frank, I think under healthcare reform, with this push for these accountable care organizations, it reflects this idea of wanting to keep a patient within a particular healthcare system. The idea being that the physicians and other providers within that system, they're on a common health IT system, so they can better communicate with one another about the patient's condition, and they can work together. Yeah, so I think.
Concerns?
Do I have ethical concerns? I guess it's a little bit case specific because I am sort of sympathetic with this idea of wanting to keep physicians within a system because frankly, in many cases, that might be better for the patient to the extent that it allows there are various healthcare providers to better coordinate care. But it sounds to me like you're talking about an example where you have a particular patient that's particularly, sick, and it really is the expert at the other center. And so I think there are definitely some ethical considerations there. It's an interesting question that frankly, I'd have to think a little bit more about that.
I just encourage you to
okay.
put it on your thinking list.
Okay, will do.
I'm wondering, in your whole schema, where is the role of the patient in being an informed consumer? I mean, I have a choice in where I am treated and by whom to a certain extent. How do I determine whether or not my physician is practicing within the norms of his profession generally? Is he an outlier with respect to his particular group at that institution? How does his normal regimen approach compare with his colleagues at another institution? And how do I find this out so that I can make a decision for my own care?
That's a great question, and frankly, there's no great answer to that. But I will say that under the Affordable Care Act, there are various provisions that are meant to sort of collect more data on both at the hospital level and the individual physician level on patient outcomes, and to make that publicly available. You actually can go now. I don't know how many of you have actually done this, but I actually have I make my students do this in one of my classes. But there's the Hospital Compare.gov website, where you can compare different hospitals. And so some of that information is out there for the savvy consumer that at least wants to, compare patient outcomes. But you're right. I think at some level we are going to end up with a system where there's just, this group of doctors and, the organization over here follow this set of norms and this group follows this set of norms. And you, as a patient, you don't necessarily know. So I think that's why it's...
You raised the issue of, the one was for aggressive treatment at all costs versus quality of life. And, those are two very different things. And
Right.
if you're the patient,
How do you know?
yeah.
Some protections can be found in informed consent law. To the, ideally the physician is saying, here are the options. The reality, though, is, and it kind of gives to the patient, do you want to do the aggressive treatment or should we maybe do watchful waiting? But I think the reality is a lot of patients just defer to what their doctors say and they're kind of influenced by, how the doctor presents that information. And in some cases, doctors don't present the information. So, you raise this question that relates to sort of a broader issue that I've been thinking about, which is, how do we sort of regulate or oversee these organizations to ensure that they're, providing appropriate care which would be some range of what's appropriate. And I'm struggling to find good answers to that. And I've started looking at what other countries do, and I'm frankly not seeing too much in other countries too that are actually, more explicitly rationing care. But if anyone has any thoughts, I really would welcome that.
We have one more question.
I really enjoyed your talk. I'm
you.
left very curious about the physician's perspective of your findings and understanding that you haven't done a scientific study. I'm wondering whether you have any anecdotal evidence of, speaking with physicians and whether they wholeheartedly agree, yes, it is like this, whether they deny it or whether it runs the gamut.
I don't have too much evidence yet, but, my best friend and her husband are both doctors, and when I was chatting with them about it, I kind of expected them to bristle a little bit at what I was saying, but they were just nodding their heads like, yep, that's true. So that's at least, anecdotally a few people I've talked to that do agree. But I would be curious if there's any doctors in the room and what their views are. Any doctors in it? Nope. No, there's a doctor. Okay.
Okay.
So
Well, I think we need to end so we can clear the room for 1:15 classes. Thank you so much.